Hello, good evening, and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Today is day 7. As announced previously, in 8 lectures, our endeavor is to comprehensively cover all the important chapters of this book, Indian Constitution at Work, which is a textbook in political science for class 11th. We have covered 6 lectures till now. Today is lecture number 7, and we will discuss a very beautiful chapter, Constitution as a Living Document. And if you are liking these sessions, if you are gaining knowledge that is aiding your civil services preparation through these lectures, do consider liking this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet. Let's get started and let's look at idea number 1. Are constitutions static? If we look at Indian Constitution, which was enacted on the 26th of January 1950, this constitution has been amended, which means modified, altered, 106 times since 1950. But remember, it is the same constitution which is still in force. Yes, the same constitution has been amended multiple times, 106 times in total, but it is the same constitution which is in force even today. Unlike some other countries, for example, we have had Soviet Union, which have had 4 constitutions in its history. In fact, when Soviet Union got dismembered in 1991, after that, they have had their own constitution as well. And that constitution came into force in 1993. If we look at France, for example, they have had multiple constitutions enacted at different points in time in their history. But does that mean that our constitution was so good that there was no need to replace it with a new constitution? Number one. Number two, does that mean the makers of the constitution were so far-sighted and wise that they could anticipate changes that can happen in the Indian society and reflected those changes in the Constitution of 1950 itself? We will try and address both these questions in this lecture today. But first up, when Constitution was to be enacted, when Constituent Assembly debated the provisions of the Constitution, Pandit Nehru made an important and interesting statement. What Pandit Nehru said? Constitution is basically what? Something that we have discussed in lecture number 1. Constitution is a document of people's faith and aspirations. But aspirations keep on changing. What were the aspirations of the people of this country in 1950 may not have been the aspirations of the people of this country in the 1990s after the liberalization of our economy, may not be the aspirations of the people of India in 2024, and clearly may not be the aspirations of the people of India in 2050. So if Constitution is a document of people's faith and aspirations, this Constitution should also reflect the changing needs and aspirations of the people. That's why constitutions should never be static. And that's what Pandit Nehru said. Any genuine demand by the people should be capable of realization. And that is what leads us towards a process called amendment of the Constitution. Because constitutions should not be static, they should reflect the changing needs of the society and the aspirations of the people. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar went a step further and he said, the constitution that I've created, it is not possible that 100% of the people will be satisfied with it. Clearly, it's not possible to satisfy 100% of the audience. But if you are not satisfied with the constitution that I've created, that I've drafted, then all you need to do, get 2/3 majority in the parliament and change the constitution. And remember, in parliament, we will have members elected by the people by universal adult franchise. That means all the adults. It's not that selectively some people will be allowed to vote. All the adults will be allowed to vote, will have the right to vote. They will elect their representatives in the parliament. So if you are not satisfied with the constitution that I have drafted, all you need to do, get 2/3 majority in the parliament and change it. And if you cannot get 2/3 majority of the legislators elected by the universal adult franchise, then I can say that only you are dissatisfied with this constitution. Your dissatisfaction is not shared by the majority. Because if it is shared by majority, you will be able to elicit the support of 2/3 of the members of the parliament, and you can change the constitution. Something else. In a society, those who are responsible for drafting the constitution, for example, the members of the Constituent Assembly, they faced one common challenge, that the constitution that we are drafting, should it reflect the efforts that we have to make to tackle the problems of today, or to tackle the problems of tomorrow? So should the constitution that we are drafting reflect the efforts that we have to make to solve the problems of today, or should we also have foresight? Should we also anticipate what are the problems that the people of this country are going to face in the future? Since they cannot anticipate all the problems, all the concerns, all the aspirations of the people later on, that is why there is a need to amend the constitution so that this document reflects the aspirations of the people of today. And they created a constitution with a balance. Balance in the sense, constitution was kept above the ordinary law. That means if we have the hierarchy in India, at the top of the hierarchy we have the constitution. Just below the constitution we have the laws enacted by the legislature. Just below that we have the rules issued by the executive. So how did the Constituent Assembly, the makers of the constitution, envisage our constitution? By keeping it at a higher pedestal than the ordinary laws, and also ensure that other generations, future generations, will respect this constitution. Let's look at something else. How to amend the constitution. For that, there is a provision in the constitution, Article 368. And this power to amend the constitution is given to Parliament. Because when we discussed legislature chapter, I told you that there are multiple roles and functions performed by the legislature, by the Parliament. And one such role is the constituent power of the Parliament. Which means, to amend the constitution, we do not need to set up, and there is no need to set up a constituent assembly. The same Parliament elected by the people will have the constituent power as well. That means they can use Article 368 to amend the constitution. And what is this amendment? Parliament will use its power, exercise its power. It can add something, it can vary something in the constitution, it can repeal any provision of the constitution. This is what we call amendment. Adding something to the constitution, varying something, modifying something from the constitution, in the constitution, and repealing something from the constitution. That is what we call amendment. And look at the question that was asked this year in the prelims examination. As per Article 368, the Parliament may amend any provision of the Constitution by way of addition, variation, repeal, all the three. This is the right answer. So this question you can easily answer by reading the NCERT. This is what we call amendment to the Constitution. But now we also need to understand, is this process of amending the Constitution rigid or is it flexible? And what do we mean by rigidity and the flexibility? I will first tell you what is mentioned in NCERT, and then I will go a step further and give you another important and real concept surrounding these two terms, rigidity and flexibility. NCERT says, read this paragraph, a constitution that can be very easily changed or modified is often called flexible. In case the constitutions are very difficult to amend, they are described as rigid. This is what is mentioned in NCERT. But there is another explanation of rigidity and flexibility. To my understanding, rigidity of the constitution does not mean that constitutions are very difficult to amend. Flexibility does not mean that constitutions are very easy to amend. Rigidity means whether this power to amend the constitution should be given only to the central legislature, which is the parliament, or whether this power should be shared with the state legislatures as well. Because we are a federal polity. And in federal polity, there is a role for the central legislature, parliament. There is a role for all the state legislatures as well at the state level. Rigidity in a federal polity, in federal constitutions mean that if you need to amend the constitution, it has to be a joint act. Both parliament, central legislature, and the state legislature should come together to amend the constitution. If that is the case, then the constitution is rigid. If that is not the case, then the constitution is flexible. Sir, then is our constitution rigid or flexible? It is a mix of both. There are some provisions of the constitution which I will tell you later. Those provisions cannot be altered, cannot be varied, cannot be changed unless and until the state legislatures accept. But there are some provisions which can be changed unilaterally by the central legislature, which is the parliament. And for that, we do not need the approval, the consent, or what is called the ratification by the state legislatures. Another important concept, and this is where I humbly disagree with NCERT, another mistake that we need to point out. It says constitution, how can we amend the constitution? And it says constitution can be amended by simple majority, by special majority plus ratification of half of the states. But this is incorrect. So then what is the correct explanation? If there is a question asked in the examination, you need to ensure that constitution can be amended only by special majority. Constitution cannot be amended by simple majority. Constitution can only be amended by special majority. Yes, there are some provisions of the Indian Constitution which you can change, which you can modify, which you can alter by passing a law by simple majority. Yes, that is true, but we don't call it amendment. Amendment is only taking the root of Article 368, getting special majority and changing the Constitution. Yes, there are some provisions of the Indian Constitution which can be altered, which can be modified, which can be varied by simple majority. But Constitution itself says that when you do this, we don't call it amendment. When we don't call it amendment, that means you don't have to resort to Article 368. When you don't have to resort to Article 368, that means you need to pass a law by simple majority. How, sir? Let me give you some instances. For example, Constitution said the official language of the Union shall be Hindi in Devanagari script. But for 15 years from the commencement of the Constitution, English, which was used previously, will also continue. Which means, what is the official language of the Union? Hindi in Devanagari script. But Constitution further says that for 15 years from the commencement of the Constitution, English, which was used previously as the official language, will continue to be official language, but only for 15 years. After that, only Hindi shall be the official language of the Union. But Constitution further said, can it happen that even after the expiry of 15 years, English can still continue to be the official language of the Union? Yes. But who will decide that? Whether English will continue even after 15 years, that will be decided by the Parliament. And how will Parliament decide it? By passing a law. And what sort of majority is required to pass that law? Simple majority. That means Constitution itself says, when the Parliament decides to extend the official language of the Union, English, beyond 15 years, for that you can pass a law by simple majority. This change shall not be deemed as amendment to the Constitution. Constitution said originally in 1950 that there shall be a Supreme Court of India headed by the Chief Justice of India and not more than 7 judges. 7 other judges, also known as 7 puisne judges. So Constitution says what is going to be the composition of the Supreme Court. There shall be a Supreme Court of India headed by the Chief Justice of India and not more than 7 judges. But can we increase the number of judges? Yes. Who can increase the number of judges? Something that I told you yesterday. Who has the power to increase the composition of the Supreme Court? Parliament. And how will Parliament increase the number of judges to the Supreme Court? By passing a law. And this law should be passed by simple majority. Which means even if you are changing the Constitution, because if Constitution says that there can be Chief Justice of India and not more than 7 judges, and now you are changing it, you are saying we will have Chief Justice of India and 33 other judges, which means, are you not amending the Constitution? Yes, you are. But Constitution further says, when Parliament increases the number of judges, this increase shall not be deemed as amendment to the Constitution. When it is not deemed as amendment, that means you don't need Article 368. When you don't need Article 368, that means you don't need special majority. Then what is the majority required? Simple majority. Simple. What are we discussing? Should Constitution be static, or should it, like a living organism, be breathing, be seeing what are the changes in the society so that I can also change myself? What are the different aspirations of the people so that I can reflect those aspirations in my text? Constitution has to be a living organism. And for that we need a provision to change, modify, alter, vary the Constitution. And is there a provision in the Constitution which allows Parliament to amend, modify, vary Constitution? Yes, that is Article 368. But how do we change the Constitution? How do we amend the Constitution? NCERT says 1 by simple majority. I disagree. Because Constitution can be amended only by special majority. That too by using Article 368. Yes, there are provisions in the Constitution which can be changed, which can be modified, which can be altered. But for that you don't need Article 368. When you don't need Article 368, that means you are not amending the Constitution. Because Constitution itself says, there are some provisions within me which you can change by simple majority, but don't call them amendment. These changes shall not be deemed as amendment to the Constitution. I gave you 2 examples. Increase in the number of the judges to the Supreme Court and providing for the continuance of English as the official language of the Union beyond what was prescribed by the Constitution as the expiry date of 15 years. I'll give you one more example. Something that I told you in the legislature, that there are some state legislatures where there is a bicameral legislature. How many states are there where we have bicameral legislature? 6. Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Maharashtra, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Karnataka. Can we abolish the Legislative Council for Karnataka? Yes. Can we provide for a Legislative Council for Madhya Pradesh, for example? Yes. Does that not mean that you need to then amend the constitution? Because constitution says these are the states where we have bicameral legislature. So if you want to repeal or you want to abolish Legislative Council for a state and you want to create a Legislative Council for another state, are you not amending the constitution? Yes. But constitution itself says when you do this, do it by simple majority. And this change, this adding of a Legislative Council to a state legislature, this abolishing of a Legislative Council from a state legislature shall not be deemed as amendment to the Constitution. So there are some changes that can be made to the Constitution by simple majority, but we don't call them amendment. Long story short, keep it in your mind, Constitution can be amended only and only and only by special majority. But what sort of special majority? One special majority is 2/3 of the members present and voting plus majority of the total membership of the House. Clear? Now listen to me carefully. For example, there are 543 members in Lok Sabha. Clear? This is where I need to make another correction here. In Lok Sabha, there are 545 members according to NCERT, but this is incorrect because there are 543 members, not 545. Sir, why does NCERT mention 545 then? Because NCERT has included 2 Anglo-Indians. Because election takes place only for 543 seats, but till 2020, there was a provision that if the President of India is satisfied that the members of the Anglo-Indian community are not sufficiently represented in the Lok Sabha, then what the President could have done, he could have nominated 2 Anglo-Indians to Lok Sabha. But this provision of nominating 2 Anglo-Indians to Lok Sabha, this was a provision in the Constitution meant only for 10 years. But every time it was about to expire, it would be extended for another 10 years, then another 10 years, then another 10 years. Just like reservation in Lok Sabha and legislative assemblies for SCs and STs. Something that we have discussed in elections and representation chapter, where I told you that there are seats reserved for SCs and STs, but this political reservation for SCs and STs was meant for 10 years. But each time it was extended by 10 more years, 10 more years, 10 more years. And this reservation for Anglo-Indians and SCs and STs was to end in 2020. But then in 2020, what happened? 104th Constitutional Amendment Act was passed. And what this 104th Constitutional Amendment Act did, it extended the reservation for SCs and STs in Lok Sabha and legislative assemblies for a further period of 10 years. But this time, reservation for Anglo-Indians was not extended again. That means only reservation for SCs and STs got extended by 10 more years without extending the same 10-year period for Anglo-Indians. That is why we do not have nomination for Anglo-Indians anymore in the Lok Sabha. There used to be one Anglo-Indian nominated to Legislative Assembly as well. If the governor of that state would be satisfied that Anglo-Indians are not sufficiently represented in the Legislative Assembly, he could have then nominated one Anglo-Indian to the Legislative Assembly. Now there is no nomination for Anglo-Indians, neither in Lok Sabha nor in the state legislative assemblies. And this is something that NCERT forgot maybe to eliminate, and that is why it is mentioning 545 members. But the number of members that we have in Lok Sabha right now is 543. Assume we need to go for one nation, one election. Simultaneous elections to the Lok Sabha and the state legislative assemblies. For that, we need to amend the constitution. And for that, what is the majority required? This is the majority required, which means you have to satisfy both the conditions. This is condition number 1, this is condition number 2. That is why plus sign. Sir, what does that mean? Assume there are 543 members and all the 543 members are present. All these 543 members are voting. And out of these 543 members, 300 are in favor of one nation, one election. 243 are against. Now you tell me, will the constitution stand amended by this type of voting pattern? The answer is no. Why? Because this condition has been satisfied. Majority of the total membership of the House. What is the total membership? 543. What is the majority of 543? When we say majority, majority means more than half. Majority is 272. So is 300 more than 272? Yes. So have we followed this particular requirement of majority of the total membership of the House? Yes, we have. But have we met condition number 1? 2/3 of the members present and voting. Is 300 more than 2/3 of the members present and voting? No. This number should have been 362. Clear? Let me give you one more explanation, one more example, hypothetical example. Assume that there are 543 MPs in Lok Sabha and there is a bill, there is a draft pending before the Lok Sabha whether this constitutional amendment bill should be passed or not. Out of this 543 MPs, 143 MPs are absent. Why? Absent in the sense they are roaming around different parts of the world. Somebody is in Italy, somebody is, and don't attribute motive, I may be referring to someone else in Italy, not necessarily one family. So some are traveling, some are in South Pole, North Pole, some are just sleeping at their homes. So 143 are absent, which means how many MPs are now present in the Lok Sabha? 400. Out of this 400, 100 abstain. Abstain in the sense there is a bill that is to be voted upon. 400 MPs are present, but only 300 MPs are voting. What about the 100 others who are present but they are not voting? They abstain. We will not vote. Why? Multiple reasons. One reason can be, hypothetically, that if we vote in favor of this bill, our people, our supporters may feel that we are in favor of the BJP. If we vote against this bill, our supporters might feel that we are in favor of the India Alliance, Congress. So we are we hope to be equidistant of both these poles, the NDA and the India Alliance. In this case, we will abstain. So now there are 300 people, 300 MPs who are voting. Out of 300, 250 are in favor and 50 are against. Will this constitutional amendment bill be passed? Is 250 more than 2/3 of the members present and voting? Absolutely yes. Should have been 201 plus. But is this 250 majority of the total membership of the House? No, it should have been 272. That means this bill will be defeated. That is why this bill, if it is introduced in the Parliament, one nation, one election, without opposition support, this bill will not be passed in the Lok Sabha. Because this is not the composition. This is unlike the composition of the Lok Sabha that we had in 2019. This is a different Lok Sabha where the opposition has a massive say. So without opposition support, this bill on one nation, one election will never be passed. So there are some provisions of the Indian Constitution which can be changed by way of simple majority, although we don't call those changes as amendments. But majority of the Constitution is changed when the Parliament, both houses of the Indian Parliament, pass a constitutional amendment bill by special majority. And listen to me carefully, this is where there is no role of a state legislature. State legislatures are not involved here. And this is how majority of the Constitution can be amended. If you want to change fundamental rights, directive principles, fundamental duties, add schedules, for that, this is the type of majority required. But Article 368 itself says, there are some provisions within me which we can claim, which we can say are part of the federal features. Federal features in the sense, for example, you need to alter Schedule 7 of the Constitution. And I've told you previously, Schedule 7 deals with distribution of legislative subjects into union list, state list, concurrent list. All the items mentioned in the union list, Parliament has the power to make laws. All the items in the state list, state legislature in normal circumstances, they have the power to make laws. And the items that are mentioned in the concurrent list, both Parliament as well as the state legislature has the power to make laws. But what if you want to amend the Constitution to transfer one item from state list to union list, one item from state list to concurrent list, or one item from concurrent list to state list? Can it happen? Yes, it can. But for that, when both houses of the Indian Parliament pass this bill should be sent to the legislatures of all the states concerned. And only when half of the state legislatures accept this constitutional amendment, accept this bill, then it will be sent to the President for signature. That means without ratification by half of the states, you cannot amend a federal feature. And one such feature is changing any of the lists mentioned in Schedule 7 of the Constitution. Because basically you are then snatching the powers of the states and giving it to center. Article 368 says, even if you want to change me, I am Article 368, you need ratification by half of the states. Article 368 further says, if you want to change the structure of the Supreme Court and High Courts, for that you need ratification by half of the states. And if you are following polity, I'll give you an explanation. When NJAC, National Judicial Appointments Commission, when this was enacted by the Parliament in 2014, this bill was sent to the state legislatures concerned as well. Only when more than half of the states ratified this NJAC, then it was sent to President for signature. Because if you change the method of appointing judges to the Supreme Court and High Court, for that you need ratification by the states. When GST was implemented in 2017, some of the taxation powers that state had were shared with the center. Some of the taxation powers that center had were shared with the states. That means you were what? You were altering Schedule 7 of the Constitution. That also required ratification by at least half of the states. Now there are two things here that you have to keep in mind. Although not mentioned here, but let me tell you. What are these two things? Sir, when we say ratification by at least half of the state legislatures, does that mean only the legislatures of the 28 states that we have in India? Or does that also include those union territories which have a legislative assembly? It includes UTs with legislative assembly. That means Delhi as well as Puducherry. And after the ongoing elections, Jammu and Kashmir as well. This is number one. Number two, sir, how can we say whether the states have ratified this constitutional amendment or not? State legislatures will have to pass a resolution. The House is of the opinion that we accept this constitutional amendment. The House is of the opinion that we will reject this constitutional amendment. Resolution is the resolve of the House. But sir, what type of majority is required for a state legislature to ratify such a constitutional amendment? That resolution should be passed by simple majority, not special majority. So long story short, if there is a bill, listen to me carefully, if there is a bill, what is a bill? Bill is a proposal. What is this bill's proposal? To amend the constitution. Maybe add a fundamental right. Maybe add a fundamental duty. Maybe remove something. If this is a bill, this bill can be introduced where? In Lok Sabha first or in Rajya Sabha first. This bill can be introduced in either of the two houses. First in Lok Sabha, then Rajya Sabha, or first in Rajya Sabha, then Lok Sabha. Your call. But sir, who can introduce this bill? Only a government minister or a private member as well? Any member. So this constitutional amendment bill can be introduced in either of the two houses of the parliament by either a minister or a private member. And the prior sanction of the president is not required. Sir, what are you saying? I am saying something that we discussed in a money bill. That whenever a money bill is introduced in the Lok Sabha, before its introduction, you need the approval of the president. President, can we introduce this money bill inside the Lok Sabha? Without president's consent, prior consent, previous sanction, you cannot introduce a money bill in the Lok Sabha. But this constitutional amendment bill can be introduced in either of the two houses by either a minister or a private member. It does not need the previous sanction of the president. And then in both the houses of the parliament, it needs special majority. And what is that special majority? This is the special majority. Sir, I have a question. Yes. Sir, we discussed in legislature that if one house accepts a bill, the other house does not. In case, then there is a deadlock. And to resolve this deadlock, there is what? Joint sitting of the two houses. Which means, if there is a joint sitting where both Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha MPs are present, because of the numerical strength of Lok Sabha, it is the will of the Lok Sabha which prevails over the joint sitting. Can this happen in a constitutional amendment bill as well? No. Sir, what are you saying? I am saying this constitutional amendment bill, which can be introduced in either of the two houses of the parliament by a minister or a private member, does not need the prior sanction of the president, and in both the houses it needs special majority separately. If one house accepts, Other house does not. The bill is dead. It cannot become a law. There is no provision for a joint sitting when it comes to a constitutional amendment bill. And if this bill affects federal features, then you need to send this bill to all the state legislatures, including the union territories which have a legislative assembly. And only when you get ratification from at least half of the states, then this bill will be sent to the president. And once president signs this constitutional amendment, constitution stands amended. Sir, I have a question. What is the question? Sir, in executive, we discuss president, and there you discuss some of the veto powers of the president. That when a bill is presented to the president may say, I am signing this bill. Or the president may say, I am not going to sign this bill. Or the president may say, I am going to send this bill back to the parliament for reconsideration. What sort of veto can be used, invoked by the president for a constitutional amendment bill? Nothing. Till 1971, he could have. She could have. But in the year 1971, Constitution was amended. 24th Constitutional Amendment Act. The year was 1971. This Constitutional Amendment Act made it mandatory, binding on the president, that you can do only one thing for a constitutional amendment bill, and that is you need to give your assent. And when an amendment bill goes to the president for his assent, in this case the president has no power to send it back for reconsideration. The president cannot even say, I'm not going to sign this bill. The president has only one role here, sign. Sir, what if president says, I'm not signing? He can't say that. But sir, what if, hypothetically? First, he should resign. Or if he doesn't resign and he says that, no, I'm not going to sign this bill, he is violating the Constitution. So what, sir? And violation of the Constitution is a ground on the basis of which the president can be impeached from his office. Clear? Let's look at something else. Why have there been so many amendments? And before we discuss this, let's take a look at this subject of amendment, whether it requires special majority or whether it needs ratification by the states. Let's do this exercise and you tell me what is the right answer here. To amend the citizenship clause, what do we need? Ratification by states or special majority? Citizenship falls under Part 2 of the Constitution. I think we need to close the live chat as well, which we will do from tomorrow. Okay. One thing is, if it is citizenship law, then you need simple majority. Because Article 11 has given the power to the Parliament that you can regulate all matters related to citizenship. And for that, Indian Parliament enacted in 1955 a law called Citizenship Act of 1955. And if you want to change that law, that's an ordinary law that needs simple majority. But what if you want to change Article 11 itself? That requires special majority. Right to freedom of religion. It's a fundamental right, requires special majority. Changes in the union list, any of the lists, it requires ratification by the states. Changes in state boundaries. Even if you want to change state boundaries, that does not require special majority, does not require ratification by the states. This is another mistake of NCERT. It requires simple majority. Provisions regarding election commission, for example, when the law, if election commission is to be altered, that requires a bill, and that bill should be passed by simple majority. But if you want to change Article 324 itself, which speaks about election commission, that requires special majority. But provisions regarding election commission would also come under simple majority. Okay, so we have done this exercise. Let's look at why have there been so many amendments. Look at this graph number 1 and graph number 2. Graph number 1 tells us the number of amendments in 10 years. Immediately after the commencement of the Constitution, from 1950 onwards, we saw limited number of amendments. But during this period, 71 to 90, we saw large number of amendments. Clear? In fact, between 1974 and 1976, 10 times Constitution was amended. Now the question on your mind, why have there been so many amendments? This is the story that you can capture from graph number 1. But then there is something else. Graph 2 tells us the time taken for every 10 amendments. So here you can see sometimes 11 years, sometimes 3 years. Why? Let's try and address this question. When we look at the contents of the amendment so far, and if we need to have a brief idea about why have there been so many amendments, the answer to this will lie in the subsequent discussions that we will have. And for that we need to understand what is the content of amendments so far. Does that mean all these 106 amendments that we have had so far, it has sufficiently, significantly altered the Constitution that we have? NCERT says that a large number of these constitutional amendments did not make any substantial difference to the Constitution. Most of these amendments were technical in nature. Technical in the sense, there was one amendment which said, let's increase the retirement age for the judges of the High Court from 60 to 62. Does it change the philosophy of the Constitution? Does it make a massive change to the Constitution? No, we are just increasing the retirement age, that's it. Salaries of the Supreme Court and High Court judges were changed. Just salaries, so technical nature. Does it change the structure of the Supreme Court? No. Does it change the powers of the Supreme Court and the High Court? No. Technical changes. I have told you that provision for SC/ST reservation in Legislative Assembly and Lok Sabha was meant for 10 years. But each time it was about to get expired, Constitution was amended to further extend this reservation for 10 years. And this has happened 7 times, in 1960, 70, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, 2020. So does that significantly amend the Constitution? No, it's a technical thing. Do you remember when we discussed President? And there I told you that there is something called Article 74 of the Constitution, which says there shall be Council of Ministers with Prime Minister at the head to aid and advise the President. Only this much was mentioned in the Constitution. But even before that, whatever advice was given by Prime Minister and Council of Ministers, that was binding on the President. But what was binding on the President, but implicitly, was made explicit in 42nd Amendment. When Article 74 was amended to say, there shall be Council of Ministers with Prime Minister at the head to aid and advise the President, who shall act on that advice. This was happening previously also. Now what was happening previously You just made an explanation in 42nd Amendment. And 44th Amendment further said the same thing, that the president may ask for reconsideration of that advice, but if the same thing happens again, the president is bound to accept it. This NCERT says, in reality, this amendment did not make any difference because that is exactly what has been happening all through. The amendment was only by way of explanation. I humbly disagree, because this was a far-reaching constitutional amendment. Because previously the president could have enjoyed his power. He could have disregarded the advice of the Prime Minister if he would feel that this advice is unfair, unjust, unreasonable, against the Constitution. So this was not an innocent constitutional amendment, as NCERT would like us to believe. This was not an amendment which was only explaining what was happening previously. No, this was a substantial amendment to the Constitution. But what NCERT is trying to tell you is that when we look at these 106 amendments, it's not that all these 106 amendments have had far-reaching consequences. That means our original Constitution is beyond recognition. What it was in 1950, that Constitution we can't recognize in 2024. That's not the case, because majority of these amendments were technical in nature, explanatory in nature, did not substantially amend the Constitution. But there were some constitutional amendments which were needed because there was difference in the interpretation of the Constitution. Sir, what are you saying? I am saying NCERT wants us to discuss why have there been so many amendments to the Constitution from 1950 to 2024. And for that we need to understand that some of the constitutional amendments were not substantial, they were only technical in nature. For example, increasing the salary, increasing the retirement age, extending SC/ST reservation. That's why we have had so many amendments. But some amendments were required because there was difference in the interpretation of the Constitution. Difference in the sense? Difference or conflict with the government. What sort of conflict? One magazine which was published in Bombay, it was called Bombay then, had to be distributed in Madras. It was called Madras then. But the Madras government banned the circulation of this magazine. Why? Because Madras government said if this magazine is circulated, distributed in Madras, it would violate public order. There may be chaos, there may be conflict. Matter went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court asked Madras government, isn't this freedom of speech and expression? Because freedom of speech and expression means say whatever you want to say, express whatever you want to express, use whichever medium you want to use to express yourself. Medium can be magazine as well. So what is written in that magazine, that is somebody's freedom of speech and expression. How can you stop it? How can you block its circulation and distribution? Madras government said, because we fear there will be a violation of public order. Constitution, Supreme Court says, does not mention anywhere that on the grounds of public order, you can block somebody's freedom of speech and expression. You can restrict somebody's freedom of speech and expression. And Supreme Court was right, because public order as a ground was not mentioned in the Constitution under Article 19, Clause 2, under which your freedom of speech and expression can be restricted. And then in the year 1951, first Constitutional Amendment Act was passed and public order was added to Article 19, Clause 2 as a reasonable restriction on which your freedom of speech and expression could be restricted. So this amendment was made possible. The reason why this amendment took place was because of differing interpretations. Similarly, Madras government again issued an order and said we are going to reserve seats in educational institutions for SCs and STs. That means on the ground of caste, the Madras government was discriminating by providing reservation to SCs and STs in engineering and medical colleges. Matter went to the court. Case came to be known as the Champak Dorai Rajan versus State of Madras, 1951. Supreme Court was asked, my lord, isn't this violation of Article 15, which says the state shall not discriminate against any citizen only on the grounds of caste, and Madras government is discriminating only on the grounds of caste? Supreme Court asked Madras government, what are you doing? You can't violate Article 15. Madras government said, sir, we are implementing Article 46. Supreme Court asked, what is Article 46? Madras government said, that you should know because you are sitting on the seat of the justice. So that I know, but what is it? Sir, it is directive principle of state policy. Supreme Court said, directive principles are inferior and fundamental rights are superior. So you can't implement this reservation order because you violate Article 15. Then how did the Parliament react? Parliament amended the Constitution and added Article 15 Clause 4 to the Constitution to say that this is the power of the state. It can reserve seats for socially and educationally backward classes of citizens, including SCs and STs. Similarly, land reforms were declared unconstitutional by the court. Zamindari system, which was abolished by the Parliament, it was declared unconstitutional because you are violating a right to property. Supreme Court said you can't do that. And how Parliament reacted? Parliament amended the Constitution and provided for 9th schedule. And 9th schedule said any law that is placed within me, judiciary cannot question that law. Any law placed in 9th schedule is immune from judicial review. And then these land reforms laws were placed in 9th schedule, bypassing fundamental rights, fundamental right to property. Similarly, on this question, whether DPSPs are inferior, fundamental rights are superior, a far-reaching constitutional amendment was made in 1971, 25th Constitutional Amendment Act, 1971, where Parliament said Article 39B, Article 39 Clause C, these are directive principles of state policy, even if they violate 3 fundamental rights, which is Article 14, 19 and 31. The law merely on this ground cannot be declared as unconstitutional. So 2 directive principles were now given superiority over 3 fundamental rights. So there were some constitutional amendments, because what is the question? Why have there been so many amendments? It's not that 106 amendments that have taken place, all of these were substantial in their nature, form and effect. Some were purely technical in nature, which does not change the substantial provisions of the Constitution. Because just by increasing the retirement age, just by increasing the salary, just by extending reservation, it does not substantially alter the Constitution. But there were some constitutional amendments which were required because there was difference in interpretation of the Constitution. Parliament felt something, judiciary felt something else. That's why we have had so many amendments. And we have had so many amendments also because for some, there have been political consensus. Some constitutional amendments. Why there have been so many constitutional amendments? Question number 1. And the answer to that is, not all amendments were substantial, but some amendments were required because there was difference in interpretation. Were all these amendments controversial? No. A large number of these constitutional amendments were made through political consensus. For example, 73rd and 74th Amendment. What it did? 73rd Amendment provided for Panchayati Raj institutions. 74th Amendment provided for urban local bodies, municipalities, municipal corporations. And both of them, they are part of a concept called local government. Listen to me carefully. And local government in the distribution of powers comes under Schedule 7, but under state list. Sir, what does that mean? That means on local government, who has the power to make laws? State legislature. But when Panchayati Raj institutions were established, they were not empowered. Elections were held, but then the panchayats were dissolved and no further election was conducted. Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister, the institutional status to panchayats and municipalities. And for that we will pass this law. Who? Parliament. State said, how dare you? In the distribution of powers, local government is a subject which is under state list. How dare can Parliament enact a law on local government? This bill was defeated in Rajya Sabha. Then VP Singh, as the Prime Minister, also tried to do this. But before he could implement it, he lost power. Then came P.V. Narasimha Rao. And P.V. Narasimha Rao and various other states, they came together, build consensus, and through this consensus, ultimately what happened? 73rd and 74th Amendment was passed. It was this consensus, which is what we call cooperative federalism, which was seen at its best in 2017 when GST was implemented. '101st Constitutional Amendment Act, which provided for goods and services tax in India, where centre shared some of the tax powers with the states. States shared some of the tax powers with the centre, created a goods and services tax council. It was only through consensus. It was only through consensus that anti-defection law was passed in 1985 because of the 52nd Constitutional Amendment. So not all amendments were controversial, but some were. One of them, 42nd Constitutional Amendment, which is also known as the mini revision or mini constitution or mini revision of Indian Constitution. Do you know this amendment made changes to the preamble? The word secular was added, socialist was added, integrity of was added to the preamble. Do you know because of this 53 articles of the Indian Constitution were modified? And this was the period when emergency was in place, which was imposed in 1975. On that, you should ask the Lok Sabha MP from Mandi, who has made a movie on Srimati Indira Gandhi, but that movie is not releasing. She would know more than me on emergency. But be that as it may, this amendment proved to be controversial. So there were some amendments which proved to be controversial, but there were some amendments which were made through political consensus. But let's go back to the first thing that we discussed. Should the Constitution be static or should it be a living organism? Should it be breathing, hearing the pulse of the people, seeing the new aspirations of the people? Constitution should not be static. Should Constitution be rigid or should Constitution be flexible? Or should it be the mix of both? And this is where a landmark judgment was given by the Supreme Court. On the 24th of April, the year was 1973, this case came to be known as the Keshavananda Bharti versus State of Kerala. Something that we have discussed previously, but if you want to understand this case in great detail, for that you just search Bharti and the Doctrine of Basic Structure on our YouTube channel. There is a detailed video lecture that I have made on the Doctrine of Basic Structure and Keshavananda Bharti. How did this doctrine evolve, whether it is good, bad or ugly. So please watch that video lecture and you will gain complete insights into this Keshavananda Bharti case. Will you be able to watch it? You can find that video lecture on the YouTube channel. I have made that video. How many amongst you will go through that video lecture after this session? Watched already. Great. Okay. Almost like a living being, this document keeps responding to the situations and circumstances arising from time to time. Watch that video lecture on Keshavananda Bharti and you will understand the contribution of judiciary when it comes to making constitution as a living document. And towards the end, let's look at something very important. When the constitution was made, leaders who were part of our freedom struggle then became part of the Constituent Assembly. Then some of them would also become part of the government. They shared a common vision of liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity of an individual, respect for fundamental rights, creating a welfare state. And luckily that vision has not disappeared. Which means even if the constitution has been subjected to 106 amendments since 1950, the basic structure of the constitution has remained the same. The fundamental value of the constitution has remained the same. So in periphery, this constitution has reflected the changing situation, the dynamics, changing realities of the time, but at its core, it's still the same. Yes, we felt the need to give a three-tier structure of government by creating local bodies. But the heart and soul of the constitution is still the same. We still uphold rule of law. We are still a parliamentary democracy. Our judiciary is still independent. Our Article 21 is still there, although it has been expanded, but core remains the same. We still have freedom of speech and expression. What Dr. Ambedkar said, if you ask me, which is the fundamental of all fundamental rights, the answer is Article 32. Article 32 is still there. So the core, soul, heart of the Constitution remains what it was in 1950 because we share the same vision. But that doesn't mean we will not be receptive to the new changes that will be evolving in the society. So when we saw that there is Ayaram, Gayaram politics happening, we changed the constitution and added anti-defection law. When we saw that there is a change, we need one nation, one tax. For that we implemented the GST. When we realized that just by lip service, we cannot empower women, we need to reserve seats for them. We amended the constitution, provided for 106th Constitutional Amendment Act, women's reservation in Lok Sabha and legislative assemblies. Although not implemented now, will be implemented after 2029, after there is delimitation and census and then delimitation. But at least We are responsive, reflective of the changing needs and requirements of the time. And that is how we can say Constitution is a living document. That's about it for today. I will see you again tomorrow, and tomorrow will be the last NCERT lecture. After that, we'll take a break, and then we will come back with political theory. Then we will come back with a judgment series, a landmark judgment series. We'll cover some of the important adjudicated by the Supreme Court of India. And if you're liking these initiatives, do let me know in the comment section, and I'll see you tomorrow, 6 o'clock in the evening. Till then, have a great time. All the best. Bye-bye.